Okay, it is 2 minutes after 2, and welcome and thank you everyone for attending this webinar and the opportunity to present our views on the new PCI software security framework. My name is Shane Parfit, Senior Manager of Product Marketing and Marketing Services here at Security Compass. We're coming at you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Also on the line, we have Rohit Sethi, Chief Operations Officer for Security Compass, who will be our presenter today, so thank you, Rohit. For this webinar, we'll keep the audio lines muted, but feel free to type any questions into the chat and we'll try to address them as we go. We'll also open up the audio lines at the end of the presentation for questions, or attempt to. First, for those of you who don't know much about us, a little bit about our company. So Security Compass is a B2B company focused on application security. And what that means is that we help other companies make their software secure. We do that mostly by focusing on building security in during the development and deployment process. And we have two main offerings that are focused on that goal. Our advisory business unit performs a variety of verification services for many large clients, such as pen testing, red teaming, vulnerability assessments, phishing simulation, and other offensive services. We also help organizations develop application security programs that work with Agile and DevOps methods. At the nucleus of this solution is SD Elements, which is our policy to execution platform for security and compliance. And we can also deliver just-in-time training, application security training for developers through integrations with SD Elements. So just a reminder that we will send a recording of this webinar to all those attending this webinar by the end of the week. And we hope you'll learn something from this. If you like this webinar or have any questions about the content, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. You can reply to the reminder emails or just send an email to info@securitycompass.com. Also, if there's any content or webinars that you'd like to see from us, please let us know and we'll consider it. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Rohit to get on with the actual planned content for this webinar. So take it away, Rohit.
Great, thanks, Shane. So just a couple seconds on myself here. I'm the COO at Security Compass. I've been in the application security space for 15 years now. I've helped a number of companies in terms of building software security programs across a variety of industries. And I was lucky enough to be invited to be part of the PCI Software Security Task Force, which we'll talk about in a minute here. I just want to reiterate that what we're going to talk about here is our own opinion. It does not reflect the official opinion of PCI SSC. However, we did find a quote from Troy Leach, who's the Chief Technology Officer at PCI, to kind of frame what this new framework is meant to represent. So the new PCI framework provides a better support for modern software development while ensuring greater transparency into the security capabilities of payment software and results in broader range of secure payment solutions. And if you try to really unearth what Troy is saying here, there's a couple of really salient points. One, if you take a look at the sort of compliance standards that are out today, and you see how they relate to secure development practices, you'll find that there's very little that forces companies to adopt security throughout their development processes. There are things along the lines of requiring security testing and penetration testing and this sort of activity, but rarely do we see a compliance mandate to embed security throughout your development process and really build a secure infrastructure. And we think that has really, significant downstream effects where people are building vulnerable software. That vulnerable software is being used by other companies, and there are vulnerabilities in that software that get breached. And really, you have to have, all these compensating controls that make up a large part of your cybersecurity program as a result of vulnerable software. So, in our view, and this is Security Compass's view, PCI is taking very much a leading stance on this. Apart from a few banking and maybe defense-related standards, there really aren't a lot that are so holistic in building security throughout the development process. The other thing that Troy mentions is modern software development. And I think this is also really important. PCI wanted to have a view that enabled the payment ecosystem to be able to build software at modern speeds. So not necessarily one release a quarter or something like that, but to align with Agile and continuous delivery / DevOps, so people can, for example, produce many releases in a day. So that was something that they had an eye towards as a design goal. Now, there's a few things that drove the need for the new PCI framework and really influenced, I think, what you'll see in the outcome. The first is, like we mentioned, the evolution of software development practices. We can't really expect a compliance regime that people build a release of an application and then they go through a really sophisticated validation process that takes weeks, because it just simply doesn't keep pace with modern software development. Another thing that PCI, and I congratulate them on having this level of awareness, is rather than being a prescriptive sort of checklist, they really wanted to move towards being objective focused, right? So you'll see in the new standard, there's a series of objectives focused on security practices, rather than there's a list of very specific tactical things that you need to do. And the idea is to validate software vendors and software products, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes here. To the extent possible, I think there was a design goal to support current and future industry technology, so to make it future-proof. And one thing that again we really commend them on is they didn't do this in isolation. They solicited input from a number of industry players to come up with a set of best practices. And this is where our role came in. So PCI created the Software Security Task Force, which included experts in software security across a variety of different organizations. I was honored to be part of that, and they took our input in developing these standards along with the input of the PCI community, and they had a couple of rounds of requests for comments on the standards. So examining the standards in a little more detail, there's three pieces to the software security framework: a secure software standard, a secure software lifecycle standard, and a validation framework. The first two, secure software standard and the secure software lifecycle standard, were both published at the start of this year. Now, the validation framework will specify more details around the compliance needs and timelines and the assessment process. But the first two standards really spell out what the organizations need to adhere to. And the first one, the secure software standard, is a rigorous standard that relies on in-depth security being integrated into the development process. And essentially it's a validation. So similar to much of what you see today in the compliance world, it's a standard that you could take an existing application and validate whether or not that software is compliant with the secure software standard. And it specifies how to do that. But what was interesting, right, was that they also decided to create a second standard, the secure software lifecycle standard. Now, the intent of this, the details of this will come out in the validation framework, so I don't believe it's finalized at this point, but the intent of this is to be able to take somebody who creates a payment application, and instead of having to go through the rigorous process of a complete application validation with every release, is to show that, in fact, you are integrating secure software development lifecycle practices such that, PCI, while still assessing specific releases of applications, won't necessarily require you to go through the same process for every release, which then thereby enables faster deployments, right, without the need to go through the same level of rigor. But in order to do that, you need to show that, in fact, you have built security into your development processes, and you have to have the audit evidence to back that up. Now, the validation framework isn't coming out till mid-2019, which invites a few questions. I guess the first question that we hear the most is, how is this going to impact us? And for a payment application vendor, that is quite clear. This is going to impact them directly, and there's been quite a bit of description from that from PCI. Anybody who has to comply with this standard, in our view, right, most organizations, unless you're talking about companies that have invested a lot of their time and resources into their secure development practices, they're gonna have to undergo some pretty major changes to the way they develop things. For example, in our view, when we go to talk to clients, we often see that organizations have doubled down on static analysis as sort of being their answer to application security. They have static analysis, and maybe to do the occasional penetration test, they might have some training. That's sort of how far they'll go for application security. When you look at the details of the standard, you have to be much more rigorous than that in every part of the process. So you're going to have to make big investments to really transform their secure development process. The other thing I think that's important is that the framework may be used for other participants in the payment ecosystem in the future. Now, we're not entirely sure, at this point what that means. That hasn't been solidified just yet, but it's been built in such a way that it's not necessarily limited to just payment applications.
Just a quick question from the chat. Is this only required for companies that validate applications through PADSS?
So the initial rollout will be scoped to PADSS, I believe, and the details again won't be made public, I think, until mid this year. So you'll have to double check on that for when it becomes official, but that's the intent. However, as I mentioned, while that might be the initial scope, there is the thought that this could be used in other parts of the payment ecosystem. A lot of people will have a question: does this apply to PCI DSS? So the much more broadly impacting standard. And for the time being, the answer is no. But that doesn't mean that'll be the case in the future necessarily.
Thanks.
Now, and I think this is a really good question. I think there's a lot of people who look at this and say, I don't have payment applications, or I don't really have to comply with PCI at all. And maybe you're in a totally different industry. I think it's still important for people to pay attention to this, because PCI has a reputation of being a precedent setter when it comes to specifically application security. Prior to PCI DSS citing the OWASP Top 10 in October 2006, there was really only a small number of standards that had heard of OWASP Top 10 and referenced them. But once PCI referenced the standard, as you'll see, this bar chart shows 6-month increments from January 2005 right through July 2013. You'll see that it started to gain steam, right? Like, people really began to hear about OWASP Top 10 in broad circles outside of a small, community of application security folks. Really became sort of, best practice, well known after the PCI DSS cited OWASP Top 10. And the way that we look at it is, the PCI is looking at making more secure software for payment applications as a starting point. It's already more rigorous than what you see in critical infrastructure, right? In most other financial applications, in healthcare applications, and medical devices. While there might be a lot of compliance requirements around some of these other regulated industries, none go to the depth that you are going to see in the PCI software security framework for building secure software. And it's going to be hard for these other industries to defend why they don't go to the same depth when it's well known that vulnerable software is really a root cause of so many breaches. So even though you might look at this and say, this doesn't really apply to me today, it's well worth paying attention and having a plan on how you're going to build this into your roadmap. At least the kinds of controls that are being documented in this standard. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire standard sort of section by section. I will describe to you a guide that we've made that you can read that will go into more detail. But to keep this a little more engaging, I'm going to focus today on 5 key tips that you should keep in mind when complying with the new standards. So the first, and I think probably most critical, is that you have to devise a systematic process for building security in early and maintaining it throughout the software lifecycle. And I would say that this has kind of fallen out of vogue lately. I think there's been a very big trend to relying on sort of scanning technologies as part of the DevOps pipeline, and not really building security in at the start of the process, because ultimately there's really been no requirement to do so. So this really changes that. You have to think about the ways that you can really integrate security at every part of the development process, not just through scanning and testing. And that process has to be documented, and you have to train people on it. Another thing that I think is going to be a change, maybe not so much for the larger organizations, but certainly for some of the smaller ones that are relatively new to application security, or have a very small application security program, is you have to define and assign roles and responsibilities within your organization that are specific to application or product security. And one of the things I think that's a design goal here is not to have just a single person who's sort of the fall person for security vulnerabilities, but to show that for every area of the secure development process, there's somebody who owns it, and it makes sense that they own it, right? So I think that's also a change that people will have to keep in mind. Another thing, and really relates to the first one, that is a requirement in the Secure Lifecycle Standard is to automate threat identification and the definition of security controls, or essentially security requirements. Again, something that is really never a must in most compliance standards is now become a must. And if you try to do this in a non-automated way, if you manually identify threats and you manually define the security controls, you will get in the way of the speed of the development process. So you really want to think about how you can automate this and make sure that you are continuing to have modern software development. Another thing that's important is you have to create a process for continuously identifying and fixing security defects. So a lot of companies take the stance of doing a periodic assessment, for example, a penetration test on an annual basis for their applications. That won't fly under the standard. And not only will it not fly just to do penetration tests, but even if you did static analysis, and let's say you did it once a year or twice a year, that doesn't really fit with having security testing embedded in your development process. So again, that's going to be a change for a lot of the organizations who need to comply with this. Another one, and again, I applaud PCI for thinking about this, is the need to communicate with clients and stakeholders about security. One of the really frustrating things in security is when vendors create applications or software, and they are, for example, default passwords. And there's a hardening step that when someone deploys the software, that they really need to make sure that they change these defaults. Well, this is something that's now required. You have to have the appropriate documentation to help your clients make sure that they can deploy your product securely, and that you have the right channels and mechanisms to communicate with stakeholders. So while it's not stipulated necessarily in the standard, one of the best practices that we think a lot of companies will do is to have a security mailing list where, for example, researchers can contact them about a vulnerability that they've discovered, and have a standard process for responding to those vulnerabilities. Again, absent of having a compliance standard for this, most companies don't need to have it. Now, larger companies will tend to have already thought about this just because they've had to deal with it so much over the years, but smaller payment applications, smaller vendors, this may be something new that they have to think about. Now, one thing I think that's really important, the question that comes up the most, and I imagine is running through the minds of several of the participants on this call, is why do anything now? After all, the standard has not come out. We don't know yet when you have to be compliant. The validation framework has not been released yet. And oftentimes we'll hear people say, well, this is not a problem for me right now, I can wait. And I want you to think through that a little bit, because the changes that we're talking about, embedding security into every part of your development processes, from our experience, and we've done a lot of these, right? We've worked with many companies to help them embed security into their software development process. That's not something you can just snap your fingers and make it happen. This isn't the same thing as, deploying one security product, turning it on and saying that you're compliant. It is really changing the way that you develop software. And hopefully not in a way that slows down the way you develop software, but it's a major change. And like any major change, if you're a company, even 50 people or more, rolling out a major change in process takes time, right? And so for those companies that have hundreds or thousands of developers, you can imagine this is a multi-year process. And so if you wait to find out when you have to be compliant, and if you find out that you have to be compliant, let's say in the next 12 months, you may not have enough runway to make these changes. So I would implore you to think about starting now, right? That doesn't mean do everything. You can start to use organizational change management best practices. For example, instead of rolling out every change that you have to do to be compliant, you can focus on the first one or two. Instead of rolling it across the organization, you can focus on, let's say, one or two development teams, and then you can spend time iterating and improving. When you are forced to do it under the gun of compliance, where you have a specific date, if you don't have enough time, then what happens is you force, and we've seen this happen over and over again, right? You force your development teams to drastically change the way they're doing things really quickly, adopt a whole series of things that they weren't doing before, and that inevitably has an impact on your productivity. And when it has an impact on the productivity of your product teams, that has an impact to your business, right? That means you won't be able to release things at the same speed as you were before because they're undergoing so much change at once. And so, we believe that if you get ahead of the standard, you start to make movements now, you'll have a competitive edge. And for the organizations that don't fall under the purview of this standard to begin with, that is even more pronounced. The earlier you get ahead of these standards, keep in mind, you'll be baking security into your development process. So there will be an inherent ROI to this. You will be preventing vulnerabilities rather than finding vulnerabilities and fixing them in a way that perhaps a lot of your competitors aren't doing today. So something to keep in mind. And when it inevitably happens that the other compliance standards change to follow PCI, you'll already be there. Talk a little bit about what we can do to help you comply. One of the key things is we really think that the SD Elements product will help organizations comply with the PCI software security standards, and particularly the Secure Lifecycle Standard. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the functionality of SD Elements. We're happy to follow up on that afterwards. But essentially, SD Elements is an expert system that translates high-level policy into actionable tasks for technical teams. And so when you look at some of the requirements in PCI and the Secure Lifecycle Standard, there's specific functionality in SD Elements that will help you comply with this in an automated way. For example, you need to identify threats. It's one of the requirements. We can help you do that in an automated way through SD Elements. Then you have to generate corresponding controls or requirements. And again, this is something that SD Elements can automatically help you with. Not only can we help to define these, but we can push them into Jira or Microsoft Team Foundation Server or another application lifecycle management tool that you may be using, so you're minimizing the impact to the development teams. Then there's the linking of security testing to requirements. You have to be able to show that these controls that you created are actually being tested for. And we provide that traceability out of the box within SD Elements. And finally, you need to have the reporting and audit capabilities, which again, SD Elements will provide out of the box. So you spend less time worrying about documentation and more time building software. This slide really just describes all the things I talked about. So I'll leave this here for you so that when in case you want to review the deck later, you have all the material. Another thing that we'll help with is e-learning and just-in-time training. So another major requirement of the standard in the Secure Lifecycle Standard is to make sure that you have role-based training, right? You have the appropriate training for the appropriate roles in the development process around security. And we, of course, have a e-learning that is role-based that can help you. And in fact, we have a certificate program, the SSP program, that you can stipulate sort of a minimum standard for everybody in the development process to reach. And you can have confidence then that they have the requisite amount of training, and you can show that to an auditor. Other things to keep in mind, we are actually creating a course on the PCI Secure Software Lifecycle, so to understand all the details of it, and that's going to be released in April this year. Another thing that we feature within the SD Elements product is what we call just-in-time training. So this is the idea of taking security training and embedding it into the security requirements definition. So essentially you open a Jira ticket and there's a user story on how to do something from a security perspective, and inside of it, there's an embedded training module. So a little bit more about that training class we're talking about. Really helps you to sort of understand all of the various pieces of the process and how people practically implement these things today. Another thing that we can help you with is in our services. So one thing to keep in mind, thinking back to the fact that you now have to identify security controls in the development process. It's a requirement, and that you have to be able to test for these things. Doing it in a manual way is really a non-starter for most organizations. So whether you use SD Elements or you try to build something yourself, there's really a need for automation there. And unfortunately, it's not the kind of thing that you can just plug and play. You're talking about a change to development process. So we can help by way of the implementation to make sure that it's successful and that you will meet the compliance standards. We also can help in our verification services, so to help to do penetration testing and do testing that is commensurate with the security standard, the PCI software security standard. To clarify, though, we are not a QSA. So this is really just to help you in terms of getting prepared. Now, it's not just about tools. For you to be compliant, you have to, of course, make changes to processes. You have to have the right people. You have to have the right education. One thing that will become clear if you look through the standards is that you need to have a defined documented software security policy. So to help you get started with that, we've created a generic software security policy template. And for all of you attending today, we'll be reaching out with an example template that you can get started with. And then you can fine tune and tailor as you see fit. We have a few other resources. So a dark reading article that goes over some of the things I talked about today. We also have a more detailed guide, as well as a 2-page summary. And we have the sample policy that we talked about. If you know anybody else who's interested, just let us know and we can furnish that for them. I'm gonna hand it over to Shane now.
Great. Thank you, Rohit. That was really great. I always enjoy hearing your perspectives on these concepts, and that brings us to the end of the presentation today. Thank you very much for patiently listening to our informed views on the new PCI software security framework. We welcome your feedback, and at this point, we'd like to open it up to questions. Now, this is a new webinar platform, so I don't think I can do audio, but if you have questions, type them into either the chat or the Q&A. And I will recite them, and Rohit can answer them. There is one question: can you forward the links to those resources? The answer is yes. By the end of the week, we will forward this presentation deck that has all those links, in addition to the webinar recording. So all registrants and attendees will receive these resources, and all attendees will receive the sample or generic software security policy template. So we'll just wait for any questions. One question that here's one coming from the Q&A, so let me open that. Can you go over the core requirements and the add-on modules? How many modules are available today? So maybe there's some clarification. Are you talking about modules in the standard or modules in our training course?
It's likely the modules in the standard.
In the S3 standard, yeah.
Yeah. So I will not be going through in detail all of the requirements today. Just simply that we've written these down. It's probably not a productive exercise to sort of talk through each one in presentation format, but we will forward the links that give you the details around it now. As far as the modules go, unfortunately I'm unsure. I don't know where that is in terms of the modules by different kinds of applications. So just to clarify, the standards have described particularly secure software standard, that there's going to be modules specific to different application types. And I don't, unfortunately, I can't answer, what's been done so far. I'm not sure.
One question, or someone said in the chat, right now there are two modules, the core and payment module. So that's a comment from one of the attendees. One other question, what happens to the PA-DSS standard in light of the new standard?
Right. Yeah, so I believe that PCI has made it public that they're going to phase out PA-DSS over some time now. Shane, do we know the date? Is it, I think in a couple of years they're gonna.
Yeah, in 2020 is the target date that they have to phase it out completely, although that may change.
Right. Yeah. And it'll be wrapped into this standard.
Okay. And how does this standard compare to, other standards that we hear of updates like NIST 800-53 and, other industries that tend to get, a lot of press for being good?
Yeah, good question. I think the really important thing to take away from this is that there's lots of other standards out there. Almost none of them really go into much depth on how to build security into the development process or go to this level of rigor for secure software. Now, I'm talking about, compliance standards. There are frameworks and maturity models. So for example, the building security and maturity model, BSIM, is quite rigorous in what it covers from a secure development process. There is an ISO 2734 standard, which is also quite rigorous. Our experience has been that it's very rarely adopted. So it's been around to some extent, not in complete form, but to some extent for a number of years, and hasn't really gained much traction. Outside of that, when you think about NIST 853, certainly a lot of controls documented in NIST 853, but it really doesn't specify, to the degree of depth on how you need to integrate security into your development process. It's more holistic than that, although there is some coverage of secure development.
Okay, so there's a theme shaping up about, when and how people need to be compliant. So the next question is, if you could take a wild guess whether this new framework will extend to all PCI DSS compliant companies, when do you think that would be?
Wow. I would imagine that, we're talking about a standard, so it's not a small organization. Like there's a lot of impact to doing a change like this. So I doubt that a change like this would happen before 2021. I doubt. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not a representative of the PCI Council. I might be completely wrong about that, but my guess would be they'd want to have a couple of years of having rolled this out under their belt before they really make the wide change to DSS. However, I believe that there will be other standards that will make changes prior to this. There's already some talk about potential cybersecurity regulation in the EU, and I'm not talking about GDPR, but that actually impacts product development. And I think that they'll likely take a cue from this. There's NIST, so the NIST standard, which isn't a compliance requirement for most organizations, but for anyone who has to comply with FISMA, you have to look at NIST standards. I believe that they'll be coming up with something that's a little more rigorous from a secure software development process. And it's just a matter of time before medical devices, automotive, energy utility, right? We'll have to sort of take a cue from this. And I think that may even move faster than it being, some of those, obviously not all of them, but some of them may move faster than it being a requirement unilaterally for PCI DSS. That's my guess, though.
Okay, thank you. We'll see how that turns out, right?
Yeah.
So next question, do you know when training will be available on the S3, the Software Security Framework or Software Security Standards, and SDLC, and will it be available only to PA-QSA companies, or will it be open to participating organizations as well?
Right, so I can't speak on behalf of PCI. I don't know the plans specific for how they're going to roll out training. We, of course, will offer training on the Secure Lifecycle, which will be available next month.
So last chance for questions for Rohit. Another few seconds for anyone who can think of any more questions. Okay.
Oh, there's one more.
Oh, one more. Will you be at the North American PCI community meeting? If it's the one in Vancouver in September, we are planning to attend that one. I know there are a few others, but yes, we'll be at the one in Vancouver in September.
And I will likely personally be there as well.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks again, Rohit. It's great to have an expert such as yourself here to answer these questions directly. Before we close off the webinar, in addition to the PCI event, we'd like to let you know that we'll be attending the Gartner Security and Risk Management Summit in June this year. So if any of you are attending this show, drop by our booth. We'd like to talk to you. And I think we can end this webinar now. So another reminder, we will send out the recording and slide deck to you all by the end of the week, along with the links to those materials that Rohit has referenced in the webinar. And we'll follow up on any questions or comments we receive by email. So again, please don't hesitate to contact us about anything. Also, let us know if there's anything that you'd like to see from us in the way of webinars or other content. You can reply directly to the webinar emails, or you can email to info@securitycompass.com. So thanks again to everyone for attending this webinar. We hope this has been interesting for you, and we hope you have just a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again.